The headlines you see today might look like a recycled real estate dispute from years past, a billionaire's eccentric fixation on the world's largest island. But if you look closer at the events of this week, you'll realize we have crossed a Rubicon in the history of the Western Alliance. On January 6, 2026, in the quiet, gilded rooms of the Canadian Embassy in Paris, a new and startling geopolitical reality was born. Standing beside Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't just offer a polite diplomatic platitude. He drew a hard line in the Arctic permafrost by declaring that the future of Greenland will be decided solely by the people of Denmark and Greenland. Carney was doing something far more radical than defending a border. He was issuing a direct public repudiation of the President of the United States. This wasn't the usual back-channel hedging we expect from middle powers. This was a signal that the unspoken rules of the Arctic, and perhaps the entire NATO alliance, have fundamentally collapsed. To understand why this moment feels so electric, you have to understand the shift from musing to menace. In his first term, Donald Trump's interest in Greenland was treated by many as a punchline, a real estate deal that went nowhere. But in 2026, the rhetoric has shed its absurdity and taken on a much darker, more martial tone. The White House has now explicitly stated that military force is an option for annexing the island. They have appointed a special envoy with the singular mission of bringing Greenland under the American flag. This isn't just about minerals or shipping lanes anymore. It is a challenge to the very concept of sovereignty between friends. When a superpower tells a NATO ally that their territory is negotiable, the alliance ceases to be a mutual defense pact and starts to look like a protection racket. Canada's response has been remarkably swift and strategically deep. By announcing the opening of a consulate in Nuuk this February and sending Governor-General Mary Simon, the first Inuk to hold that office, Carney is playing a sophisticated hand. He is leveraging the shared, Indigenous heritage of the Arctic to tell Washington that this isn't just a map exercise. It's about people, self-determination, and a culture that predates the modern American state. It is a brilliant bit of diplomatic jiu-jitsu. If the U.S. attempts to move on Greenland, they aren't just bullying a small European nation. They are trampling on the rights of Indigenous peoples, a move that would ignite a firestorm of resistance not just in Nuuk, but in Ottawa and across the global stage. Historically, the Arctic was the one place where the Arctic Council spirit mostly kept the peace. A high north low-tension zone. The United States was the big brother, and countries like Canada and Denmark were happy to let Washington pick up the tab for heavy-duty security. But that trust was built on the assumption that the big brother wouldn't try to take your house. The moment the White House suggested that Danish sovereignty was an obstacle to American national security, that entire framework evaporated. What we are seeing now is the birth of an Arctic bloc, a coalition of middle powers and European allies, who are beginning to realize that the greatest threat to their territorial integrity might not be coming from the east, but from across their southern border. When Carney stood in Paris and spoke of territorial integrity as a non-negotiable principle, he was intentionally using the exact same language the West uses to condemn the invasion of Ukraine. The subtext was devastating. He was placing the United States in the same category as the revisionist powers they are supposed to be deterring. This is a profound institutional crisis. NATO is built on Article 5, the idea that an attack on one is an attack on all. But the treaty never really envisioned what happens when the core member of the alliance becomes the one making the threats. By siding so aggressively with Denmark, Canada has effectively joined a coalition of the sovereigns, signaling that they will prioritize the rules of international law over the whims of their most important trading partner. This shift isn't just about high-level diplomacy. It's about how systems react to the breakdown of norms. For decades, the Canada-US relationship was governed by gentlemen's agreements, the idea that even when we disagreed, the fundamental borders of our world were settled. When those norms are discarded in favor of the law of force, as some in the Trump administration have called it, the system enters a defensive crouch. Canada is no longer just a neighbor. It is becoming a buffer. The decision to open a consulate in Nuuk is a tripwire strategy. It puts Canadian officials and high-ranking symbols of the state on the ground, making any American move on Greenland an immediate international incident involving a second NATO ally. As we watch this unfold, we have to ask what this does to the collective psyche of the North. For the 56,000 people living in Greenland, the island isn't a strategic asset or a mineral bank. It is home. For the Inuit communities that span the Canadian Arctic and Greenland, these borders have always been somewhat artificial, but the sovereignty they represent is the only thing protecting their way of life from being swallowed by great power competition. By sending Mary Simon, Canada is acknowledging that the Arctic belongs to those who live there, not those who want to mine it. It is a powerful human-centric rebuttal to a transactional view of the world, and it sets the stage for a much larger confrontation over who truly owns the future of the North. Canada and Denmark's Arctic Pact. This video provides a direct look at the unified response from NATO allies, including Canada and the UK. This diplomatic pivot by Canada is not just a defense of a remote island. It is a fundamental reconfiguration of North American security. By moving so decisively to support Denmark, Mark Carney is acknowledging a reality that many in Ottawa have whispered about for years, the era of assuming the United States is the primary guarantor of Canadian sovereignty is over. When the White House explicitly states that military force is an option to redraw the map of the Arctic, it forces every neighbor of the United States to look at their own borders with new eyes. For Canada, the Arctic is not just a frozen frontier. It is a massive portion of its national identity and territory. If Washington can justify annexing Greenland based on a national security imperative or a need for minerals, what stops that same logic from being applied to the Northwest Passage or the resource-rich regions of the Canadian North? The decision to send Anita, Anand and Mary Simon to Nuuk is a masterful use of soft power to counter hardline threats. In the world of high-stakes geopolitics, presence is policy. Opening a consulate is a signal that Canada intends to have a permanent, watchful eye on the region. It creates a physical and diplomatic space where Canadian interests can coordinate directly with Greenlandic and Danish officials without needing a permission slip from Washington. Furthermore, the inclusion of the Governor-General is deeply symbolic. As an Inuk woman who has spent her life advocating for circumpolar cooperation, Mary Simon represents a bridge that the United States cannot easily cross. She speaks for a transnational Indigenous identity that sees the Arctic as a cohesive homeland rather than a collection of strategic real estate deals. Her presence reminds the world that any attempt to change Greenland's status by force is an attack on a people who have already fought for centuries for their right to exist and govern themselves. This moment also marks a significant shift in the internal mechanics of the NATO alliance. For the first time in the post-war era, we are seeing a coalition of the willing form not to support an American military objective, but to actively block one. The joint statement from France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and others is a historic no to the idea of American exceptionalism at the expense of Allied borders. When Mette Frederiksen warned that an American takeover of Greenland would be the end of NATO, she wasn't being hyperbolic. The alliance is built on the sacredness of borders. If the United States violates that principle against a member state, the very foundation of European and North American security collapses. By standing at the center of this European-led pushback, Canada is effectively moving its strategic center of gravity toward the Atlantic and the Nordics, seeking safety in a multilateral group of equals rather than under the wing of a mercurial superpower. The long-term consequences of this fracture will likely be felt in the way the Arctic is governed. For the next 50 years, we are likely to see the emergence of a Nordic-Canadian Arctic bloc that seeks to develop shipping routes and mineral resources under a framework of mutual respect and environmental stewardship, deliberately bypassing American corporate or military control. This isn't just a political spat. It is a competition over the Constitution of the North. Will it be a zone of law or a zone of power? By choosing Denmark, Canada is casting its vote for the rule of law. But in doing so, it has accepted a new level of risk in its relationship with its largest trading partner. The gentlemen's agreements of the past have been replaced by a cold, analytical calculation of survival. As we watch the consulate open in Nuuk this February, we are watching the first bricks of a new international order being laid. It is an order where the United States is no longer the undisputed leader, but a power that must be balanced and occasionally resisted by its own friends. This is a difficult and dangerous path for a middle power like Canada. But in a world where sovereignty is being treated as negotiable, standing still is the most dangerous move of all. The real question for the future is whether this unified front will be enough to deter a White House that seems increasingly emboldened to act the hard way. For now, Canada has made its choice. It will stand with its peers. It will respect its Indigenous ties. And it will defend the principle that maps are drawn by the people who live on them, not by the people who want to buy them. If you find this deep dive into the changing architecture of our global institutions valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your engagement helps us continue to analyze these complex shifts in our democracy and international order. What do you think this shift means for the future of North American stability? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments.